Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping straight into a really significant situation unfolding down in Australia. It's all about their international education sector.
That's right. And we're working from a piece in the PIE News, just out yesterday, actually. It's called Tariffing the Untariffable, written by Jeffrey Smart from the Ligon Group.
Great title. It really grabs you.
It does, and it kind of sums up the core problem we're looking at. This isn't just about, counting students. It touches on Australia's economy, its politics, even its place in the world.
So, our mission today is basically to unpack these arguments, the
Yeah.
ones around student numbers, the proposed policy changes, and, well, what it all could mean for everyone involved.
Exactly, for the universities, for the students, and for Australia more broadly.
Now, our listener, you might be thinking, okay, Australian student policy, maybe a bit specific.
hmm
But I think as we get into it, you'll see these underlying tensions, balancing the economic pluses with the pressure on housing and infrastructure, plus the politics of it all.
Yeah, these are debates happening in many countries that host international students. It's quite universal in that sense.
Okay, so the article kicks off talking about bipartisan hostility towards international education. And this is all happening around a federal election.
Right, and that's the central conflict the author points to straight away.
Hmm.
There's this narrative, and it seems to be coming from both main political sides,
Which is?
that international students are, uniquely responsible for the rental market problems, especially in big cities, Sydney, Melbourne,
They've become the focal point, it seems.
pretty much. But the article quickly pushes back on that.
How so?
Well, it argues that just blaming international students ignores everyone else on temporary visas who also need housing.
Right.
And crucially, it ignores the huge economic benefits these students actually bring in. It's a bit selective.
It feels, well, maybe politically convenient. As the article notes, students don't vote.
Exactly.
Mm.
But the author reminds us, the local businesses, the communities that do benefit from students, they certainly vote. There's a dynamic there.
Okay, let's drill down into the actual policies being suggested. The coalition specifically mentioned targeting the Go 8 universities. That's the group of 8, right? Like Melbourne Uni, Sydney Uni.
Yes, the big research-intensive ones.
Yeah.
And the main proposal, it's about student visa application fees. Big increases.
How big?
Well, AUD $2,500 for any applicant, which is already, quite steep globally.
Okay.
But here's the kicker. If you're applying to one of those Jew-8 universities, that fee jumps to AUD $5,000.
Wow, $5,000 just to apply.
Is the application fee, yeah.
So the author, Jeffrey Smart, he sees this as more than just raising money, doesn't he?
Definitely. His interpretation is that this looks like a strategic move, almost designed to put Australia's top universities, the Jew-8, at a disadvantage.
How so? Like making them less competitive?
Precisely. It could potentially weaken them on the global stage. The suggestion is maybe talented students might look elsewhere, like the UK's Russell Group universities, for example, if it becomes significantly more expensive just to apply to Australia's best.
So what could happen to these Go 8 unis if these policies actually come in? Sounds like it could be pretty damaging.
It does. The piece quotes a senior Go 8 leader who's worried they might have to cut courses for Australian students.
Really? Domestic students?
Yes, or even suspend critical research programs because the international student revenue stream shrinks.
That raises a huge question then, doesn't it? About the long-term impact on Australia's research power and just the quality of education for everyone if the top unis are squeezed financially.
Absolutely. And it connects to another point raised in the article about diversity and soft diplomacy.
Okay, what's the link there?
Well, this same Go 8 leader voiced concern that higher fees could make their international student body much less diverse. You might end up with only students from very wealthy backgrounds.
And that matters because
Because diversity in the classroom is valuable in itself. But also, these students build connections. They go home, often become leaders, and they have this positive association with Australia. That's the powerful soft diplomacy. It builds bridges, fosters understanding. Reducing diversity could weaken that.
Interesting. Now, there seems to be this assumption, maybe on both political sides, that if you limit student numbers in the big cities,
Mm-hmm.
those students will just automatically go study in regional areas instead. Is that realistic?
Well, that is the assumption underpinning some of this thinking,
Yep.
but the article points out something quite telling.
What's that?
Many regional universities have actually set up campuses in Sydney and Melbourne,
Huh.
which strongly suggests where international students generally prefer to be, right? regardless of where the uni's main campus is located.
So just capping city numbers might not actually push students out to the regions like they hope?
It might not be that simple, no. It makes you wonder if the policy is really considering student choice.
Let's shift gears slightly. What about the providers outside the university system? The article touches on them too.
Yes, the non-university providers. And it's a really varied group.
How so?
The author makes a clear distinction. Many are legitimate, high-quality places, sometimes linked to unis, sometimes independent. But there's also a concern that a number of others seem more focused on just bringing in revenue, maybe exploiting loopholes in the regulations, not really focusing on good educational outcomes.
And that connects to some other trends mentioned, doesn't it? Something about visas and the Administrative Review Tribunal, the RT.
It does. Apparently, there's been a notable uptick in students talking online, on social media, about their experiences with the RT related to visa decisions.
So the RT reviews government decisions like visas.
Exactly. And there's a perception that decisions about providers who might be, let's say, suspect aren't happening quickly enough.
And there's this phrase used, an endless appeal process.
Yeah, the author flags that, almost questioning if it's a loophole that lets some questionable providers keep operating even when serious concerns have been raised.
It suggests the regulatory system might be struggling to keep up with everyone in the sector.
That seems to be the implication.
Now, back to the politics for a moment. The article mentions the Shadow Minister for Education engaging with parts of the sector.
That's right. It notes they've been consulting with education agents and private providers.
Which is interesting because...
Well, it happened while the opposition was actually fighting the government's plans to cap student numbers overall.
So who is influencing policy here? It gets a bit murky.
It does raise that question, yeah. Whose voices are loudest in shaping these potential changes?
And the coalition's own proposed caps. They're different for universities versus the other providers, aren't they?
They are. They suggested a lower cap for non-university providers, $125,000 compared to $115,000 for universities.
What do you make of that difference?
Well, it's hard to know the exact reasoning. Maybe it reflects that concern about some non-uni providers we just discussed. Or perhaps it's prioritizing one sector over the other for strategic reasons. It's not immediately obvious.
Okay, let's talk economics. The Ligon Group, where the author's from, has this concept. The Haircut, Coffee, Clothes, Food, or Tourism Index. Catchy name.
It is. And it's a really good way to think about the everyday economic impact students have.
Beyond just the big tuition fees.
Exactly. It's about the money they spend locally. In cafes, shops, on transport, rent, all that grassroots spending that supports local businesses and jobs. It makes their contribution feel much more tangible.
A real ground-level view. And the article argues their contribution goes even wider than just spending money, right?
Absolutely. It highlights things we might not immediately think of, like students volunteering locally, joining sports teams, even filling crucial trainee roles in things like healthcare.
Adding value in lots of different ways.
Multifaceted value, yes.
The author also frames attracting students as an export, like Australia exports education and skills when students go home.
And there's a great analogy used to illustrate the counter-argument, the proposed restrictions.
Which is?
It compares it to the U.S. putting a tariff on its own citizens if they decided to study in Australia.
That sounds illogical.
That's the point. It highlights how counterintuitive it seems to penalize or restrict this exchange of knowledge and skills, which ultimately benefits both sides.
And there's that really blunt quote from a senior sector leader about the economic impact.
Yes, very direct. Capping international student numbers is tantamount to capping Australia's economic growth.
Wow, that really frames it as a major economic lever.
It underlines just how significant this sector is for the whole Australian economy, way beyond the campus gates.
So if we pull all these threads together, what's the core argument about tariffing the untariffable?
The author's conclusion is basically this. Putting these kinds of limits and heavy fees on international students is like imposing tariffs on something that shouldn't be tariffed. It's an export, a valuable exchange.
In doing so is?
Ultimately, it's economic self-harm. It risks damaging a major export industry and all the benefits, economic and otherwise, that flow from it.
And it sounds like other leaders in the field feel pretty strongly too, judging by some descriptions near the end.
Oh, definitely. Comparing it to an unfunny episode of Utopia, that's a specific Australian reference, a satirical show about bureaucratic bungles.
Right.
And just calling it total madness.
Yeah.
It really conveys a sense of, well, alarm and frustration within the sector about where things might be heading.
Okay, so let's try and summarize our deep dive. It's clear Australia's international education sector is caught in some pretty strong political crosswinds right now.
Yeah, driven largely by these domestic concerns about housing and migration numbers.
And this is leading to policy proposals that, as we've discussed, could have really wide-ranging and possibly negative consequences.
For sure. And it's vital to remember this isn't just about the number of students. It's tangled up with the quality and diversity of education, their economic role in local towns and cities, and maybe even Australia's global reputation and its research strength.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. Looking at Australia's situation, what can other countries learn? Countries that also rely on international education.
hmm How do you strike that balance,
Hmm.
between the clear economic benefits students bring and the real pressures on housing and services, without, as the article puts it, resorting to economic self-harm?
And maybe thinking even bigger. What other kinds of global exchanges, things that seem inherently positive and mutually beneficial, unterrible things, might be vulnerable to similar short-term policy fixes when complex problems arise?
That's a really interesting question to ponder. Definitely food for thought.
It certainly is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.